A single jar in the pantry sealed a killer's fate. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Be part of the mystery. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your words always spark fresh curiosity. Let's get into it. There are 3 things that can be counted on to raise Nero Wolfe's blood pressure without lifting a finger. Unannounced guests, meddling with his orchids, and anyone who thinks the difference between cornichons and gherkins is just spelling. So, when a woman waltzed through the front door at 11:05 on a Thursday morning with a jar of pickles and the attitude of someone who'd already been turned down by the police and 2 private dicks, I knew we were in for a morning. She wore green on purpose, I suspected, and had a voice like chilled tea, cool, sweet, and just a little bitter. Fritz had let her in, presumably under protest, since Wolfe had made it clear this week was for preserving the sanctity of his orchid schedule. The fact that she'd bypassed me at the front room desk and ended up parked in the red leather chair across from Wolfe's was a violation I would have flagged if I hadn't been mid-donut in the kitchen. Her name, she said, was Judith Varney, and the pickles were her opening move. They're from my father's last batch, she told Wolfe as he scowled at the jar on his desk like it had opinions. I brought them because I thought you might appreciate the detail. Wolfe didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His left eyebrow had already filed a formal objection. I stood just behind his chair, leaning against the wall, mentally wagering whether she'd get the full leave at once, or the slower Miss Varney, I am not a public servant. But Judith Varney was cool. She didn't flinch. She just went on. My father died 3 weeks ago, she said. It wasn't suspicious. It was stupid. He fell off a ladder in the garage. The funeral was tidy. The will was read. No surprises. Except one. Wolfe looked up from the jar, finally. His tone had all the warmth of room temperature stone. Miss Varney, I do not handle probate disputes. It's not a dispute. Her voice sharpened a notch. It's a warning. I think someone killed a man because of a recipe. Now, I'll admit I've heard better pitches. Usually they involve money, diamonds, or adultery, preferably all 3. But I saw Wolfe pause, and not just because of the word recipe. He was registering something else. Maybe the way she said it, or maybe the way she didn't. Judith leaned forward. I know it sounds idiotic, that's why I haven't told the police, but I think you'll understand. My father, Benton Varney, wasn't just a hobbyist. His pickling was... She hesitated, then offered the word like an apology. Secretive. Wolfe closed his eyes. That's never a nap. That's him deciding whether you're worth 10 more seconds of his attention. I believe, he said at last, you have mistaken me for someone in the trade of whimsy. You brought me pickles, Miss Varney. I do not receive culinary tributes in place of facts. Please state the nature of the warning. She reached into her handbag and produced a small slip of paper, folded, like a banker's apology. It was in my father's study, she said, tucked inside a French copy of La Science du Goût. I didn't think much of it until last night when I realized it wasn't his handwriting. I took the note from her and glanced it over. No signature, no threats. Just one sentence printed, neatly in block capitals. He knew, and that was a mistake. I handed it to Wolfe, who gave it the look he usually reserved for amateurish forgery. He was careful, Judith said, her voice softer now. He never shared his process. He sold to a handful of exclusive grocers, gourmet restaurants. He had a waiting list. But I think someone got wind of it, tried to pressure him into selling the formula, and when he wouldn't, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Wolfe sighed deeply, as if peeling himself away from his own resistance. A recipe, he muttered. A secret. A dead man. And now, this intrusion. Would $25,000 make the intrusion more palatable? She asked. I didn't flinch. Wolfe didn't blink. The number wasn't astronomical, but it was polite enough to stay in the room. He reached for the bell cord. Archie. Details. That was my cue. I sat down, flipped open my notebook, and gave her my best "you've got one shot" smile. She gave us more than one. It's a rare thing for anyone to walk into the brownstone and leave a residue that sticks, but Judith Varney managed it, and I'm not talking about brine. Wolfe didn't say a word for a good 7 minutes after she left. That's not a figure of speech. I timed him. He stared at the folded note she'd brought, then at the jar of pickles still squatting on the edge of his desk, like an unwanted house guest. Finally, he muttered something about impertinent women and turned toward the elevator. "You're taking the case," I said, making it a statement, not a question. Wolfe stopped mid-rise from his chair. "Pfui, I have not said so." "You didn't have to. You didn't throw her out, you let her talk uninterrupted, and you didn't call the note piffle, which for you is practically a confession of interest." He grunted, then sat back down. "It is peculiar," he admitted. "A note without a name, a death without proof, and a daughter without hysteria. Peculiar enough to disturb the routine. That's Wolfe's version of rolling out a red carpet and handing me a to-do list." "So what's the play?" I asked. He steepled his fingers. "You will visit Miss Varney this afternoon. Ask her for a list of her father's known associates, professional and personal, and any recent inquiries regarding his process. Pay particular attention to names that reappear. And if they don't, they will," Wolfe said simply. "Anyone who goes to the trouble of leaving cryptic notes is not a one-off actor. This is a pattern, not an impulse. You're assuming the note is genuine." "I am not assuming. I am investigating the implications of its presence. That is different." He stood, the signal that the conversation, at least the useful part, was over. He'd go tend his orchids for the next 2 hours where the humidity matched his ideal temperament, and I'd head out into a colder, louder world to poke at people who probably weren't thrilled to be poked. I stopped by the kitchen first. Fritz was rearranging the spice drawer like a man performing surgery on an unstable heart. When I mentioned we'd had a client bring pickles, he winced. "Are they of quality?" "No clue. Wolfe hasn't tasted them yet. He's too busy being annoyed by their existence." He grunted in sympathy and handed me a wrapped sandwich. I took it and made my exit. A quiet kitchen and an unsettled office meant things were warming up. Judith Varney's address was tucked in the West 70s, not far from the museum, in a narrow brownstone with too many stairs and too little personality. She met me at the door herself, still wearing that dignified calm that made you wonder if she'd ever raised her voice in her life. Her apartment was neat, impersonal, a few family photos, most of them formal, a lot of books, more non-fiction than not. A single framed newspaper clipping above the kitchen counter. "Local pickler wins National Gourmet Award." A photo of her father looking proud and slightly uncomfortable, holding up a mason jar like it contained the cure to aging. She offered me coffee. I declined. I had a feeling this visit would go better with a clear head. "I'm surprised you're taking this seriously," she said, as I got my notebook out. "I was half convinced your boss would dismiss me on sight." I shrugged. "You're not the first person to walk in here with a mystery and a long face." The note got his attention. The money kept it, and the jar of pickles may have annoyed him just enough to be useful. That got the closest thing to a smile I'd seen from her. "So," I said, "let's talk about your father. I need names. Business partners, competitors, loyal clients, anyone who'd care enough about a secret recipe to either pressure him or panic." She sat at the kitchen table and pulled a yellow notepad toward her. As she wrote, she talked. My father had 3 main clients: Morelli's Fine Foods, a French bistro called L'Envie, and an organic grocer on the Lower East Side called Root and Vine. He didn't advertise. Most of his business was through word of mouth and exclusivity. That tends to breed envy. "Yes," she said simply, "especially because he never shared his method. Not even with me. I helped him jar sometimes, but the brine mixture was his alone." She handed me the list. 9 names. 3 clients, 2 vendors, 1 lawyer, and 3 friends, one of whom she said had recently stopped returning calls. Tell me about him. Elliot Bryce. He and my father met at a culinary symposium in Vermont 4 years ago. They shared a passion for historical food preservation. Elliot was intense. He once joked that my father's recipe was the last true culinary secret in the country. Do you know what he does for a living? He's a consultant. Food science, I think, works with boutique producers. The kind of person who might value a proprietary method. I jotted that down. The guy already smelled like motive. Did your father have any enemies? Anyone who resented his success? She hesitated. Not openly, but there were people who questioned his authenticity. How so? Some accused him of stealing the base recipe from an obscure Polish book. Others said his brine had unnatural shelf life. But no one ever proved anything. That was promising, nothing like a little food scandal to season a possible crime. I pocketed the list and stood. Thank you, Miss Varney. We'll be in touch. She nodded. Please don't let him dismiss this as nothing. I gave her a look. If he does, you'll be the first to know. But something tells me he's already halfway down the rabbit hole. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the list. He scanned it, made a face at the name Elliot Bryce, and set it aside. An ideologue, he said. Sounded like one. Think. He's our note leaver. Possibly, but not yet. I want to know how far the envy goes. You will visit Morelli's tomorrow. Speak to the owner. Gauge his opinion of Benton Varney and his pickles. If he lies, you'll know. And Root and Vine? Later. One variable at a time. I nodded. Anything else? Yes. He pointed to the jar, still unopened on the desk. Fritz. Fritz entered like a man summoned by fate. Open that, Wolfe said, and bring me one. You'd think he'd just ordered a live grenade defused. But Fritz obeyed. The lid came off with a pop. A waft of sharp, vinegary aroma filled the room. Garlic, dill, pepper, something sweet beneath it. Wolfe took a single pickle between thumb and forefinger, brought it to his mouth, and bit. He chewed once, twice. Then he closed his eyes. That, he said, is not ordinary. Fritz and I shared a look. The game was on. There's a particular rhythm to a Nero Wolfe case. It starts with stillness, then ripples outward. Me chasing leads, Wolfe baiting traps from his chair like a fisherman, in tweed. This one was still early in the ripple stage. I started with Morelli's Fine Foods the next morning. It's one of those specialty joints where the cheese costs more than your car payment, and the employees wear expressions that say, "Please don't touch anything unless you're wearing silk gloves." The man in charge, Leonardo Morelli, met me in a walnut-paneled back office that smelled faintly of truffle oil and ego. "You're here about Benton," he said before I'd even sat down. "Terrible business." "Accidental deaths usually are," I said. "But you don't seem surprised." He gave a sharp shrug. The man was stubborn, insisted on doing everything himself. I warned him about those ladders. "Generous of you. Did you two get along?" He tilted his head, considering the diplomatic version. He was exacting, but he delivered on time and his product sold. My clients loved his jars. We had a 3-year contract. Did he ever talk about his recipe? The method? Morelli laughed. Talk? God, no. He guarded it like state secrets. Once I asked if he'd ever consider licensing it. He looked at me like I'd offered to burn down his house. Did you push the subject? His face pinched slightly. Not more than once. I let that hang. You ever hear of a man named Elliot Bryce? Morelli's expression tightened. The way faces do when they've just touched something unpleasant. Yes, he said. Food consultant. He's been sniffing around for months. Asked if I'd ever tried replicating Benton's blend. I told him no. I'm a merchant, not a thief. Did he offer to help? Morelli gave me a dry smile. He offered to reverse engineer it. Said it'd be a shame for such a culinary treasure to die with its creator. That was a quote worth remembering. I left Morelli polishing a bottle of imported vinegar and made for L'Envie, the French bistro. The maitre d' gave me a look like I'd tracked mud on the carpet, but the chef, Camille Durand, a lean man with a knife tattoo on his forearm, was friendlier, in a vaguely unstable sort of way. "Benton," he said. "A genius, a recluse. The Da Vinci of lactofermentation. I begged him to let me watch once. Offered him a month of free meals. He said no. Did that bother you?" Of course it did, but I respected it. There are very few people who understand patience in flavor. He did. I got the sense Camille would have kissed the man's feet if he'd asked. "Did you know anyone who didn't respect it?" I asked. He shrugged. "Plenty. Everyone wants a shortcut these days, even some of his so-called friends. I heard one of them tried to blackmail him years ago. Old gossip." "Who?" "Friend from his Vermont days. Bryce. Something about notes, a lab test, I don't know. Benton told me over a bottle of wine, said it got handled, never gave details. That lined up with Judith's comment about a falling out. I asked if he knew root and vine. He waved his knife like it was a cigarette. They're too earthy. Care more about Instagram than taste, but they stalked him, yes. The owner was desperate to get an exclusive deal. Name Evan Rudd, another one for the dance card. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was ensconced in his chair, hands tented, eyes closed. Fritz had just served a plate of pheasant that smelled like victory. "I have a circle," I said. Wolfe opened one eye. 4 clients, 1 friend with questionable boundaries, and a grocer with ambition. Morelli wanted a license. Camille idolized. Him? Bryce poked around professionally and maybe personally, and Evan Rudd, owner of Root and Vine, may have been sniffing for an exclusive. I dropped the name list on Wolfe's desk. "And?" he asked. "And they all deny involvement, but Bryce's name keeps recurring. He's the only one who wasn't still singing Varney's praises after the funeral." Wolfe nodded slowly. "I dislike men who sniff," he said. "Especially when the trail leads to vinegar." He summoned Saul Panzer. Saul, as always, arrived within the hour, trench-coated and efficient. Wolfe laid out the framework. Investigate Elliot Bryce, including finances, affiliations, and any recent activity involving pickling, food science, or property acquisition. Focus on Vermont connections, Wolfe said, and cross-reference, with any patent filings in the last 6 months related to preservation techniques. Saul nodded and vanished like a magician with a deadline. Next up was Evan Rudd, the grocer. I stopped by Root and Vine that afternoon and found him stocking turmeric, like it was a sacred act. Skinny guy, wireframe glasses, smelled faintly of celery. "Yes, I carried Benton's line," he said. "Best-selling item in our preserve section. I tried to buy out the rest of his inventory after his death. His daughter refused." "She? Say why?" "Said it wouldn't be right." "And that made you angry?" His face twitched. "Disappointed. I believed in the brand." "You ever ask him to sell you the recipe?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, but I respected his no. I don't steal, I partner." "Did you ever meet Elliot Bryce?" That got a reaction. "Yes. Once. He came to a tasting we held last winter. Arrogant. Said he could duplicate. The pickle, exactly. Benton overheard and nearly threw him out. That did it. Bryce wasn't just a name in the margins, he was center stage. When I reported all this, Wolfe was surprisingly serene. "Have we contacted the attorney yet?" he asked. Judith had listed Martin Lisk, Benton's longtime lawyer. I put in a call and got an appointment. Lisk was a balding man with a voice like old wallpaper, faded, dry, and clinging to civility. He confirmed that the will was standard. With Judith, the sole heir and executor, no trusts, no codicils, but there was something strange, and go on. Benton instructed me to store a sealed envelope in the firm's safe 6 months ago. Said it was to be delivered to Judith only if something happened to him, and she started asking questions. I sat up straighter. And? She started asking, so I released it yesterday. Do you know what was in it? I didn't look. She said it was a formula, scribbled, incomplete, but it wasn't his handwriting. I left Lisk's office with a head full of static. If Benton had received the recipe, or part of it, from someone else, that changed everything. And if he'd kept that fact secret, someone might have wanted to make sure it stayed that way. Back at the brownstone, I relayed the details to Wolfe. He was silent for a long time, hands motionless. Someone, he said finally, wants control, not just of the recipe, but of the legacy. And someone else is afraid of being exposed. He leaned forward slightly. We are missing one piece. Which one? The trespass, he said. This has not yet crossed the threshold, but it will. And just like that, the brownstone was no longer just a sanctuary. It was part of the game board. I've done legwork in worse weather. Once, in January, I trailed a man from Yonkers to Staten Island through slush that could have been classified as a weapon. This wasn't that. It was a cool, dry Friday, and the city was behaving barely. But the leads Wolfe had handed me were more tangled than a politician's alibi. First, stop Elliot Bryce. You know how some people give off a vibe before they open their mouths? Bryce was like that. His brownstone office in Midtown was too clean, too scented, and too desperate to look like it hadn't been staged. A soft jazz track played on invisible speakers. I knocked twice. He opened the door like he was expecting. A food critic, yes? Archie Goodwin, I said. I work with Nero Wolfe. The reaction was subtle, but there a blink, a slow breath, and the faintest tightening of the jaw. I see. Well, come in. He led me to a glass-walled consultation room. On the shelves were food journals, chemistry textbooks, and a collection of antique jars that probably cost more than my wardrobe. What can I help you with? Benton Varney. His polite mask didn't drop. It didn't even shift. But the temperature in the room lowered. Tragic, he said. A terrible accident. You knew him? I did. We shared interests. In fermentation? In excellence, he corrected, with a small smile. Benton was one of the last purists. He believed in legacy, which I suspect is why he died without ever sharing his process. That was carefully worded, not angry, not mournful, just cool. You ever try to get him to share it? He gave a soft laugh. Everyone tried. He made something unique. I don't fault anyone for wanting to understand it. Wanting to understand it is one thing, I said. Leaving threatening notes is another. That broke the smile. Just for a second. Then it returned, tighter. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out a photocopy of the note Judith found. I'd made a few at the corner copy shop. Wolfe might have called it evidence tampering. I called it insurance. Recognize the handwriting? He took the paper, examined it like it was a riddle with a cash prize. No. Should I? If you did, I'd say. If you don't, I'll say anyway. Benton received that note before his death. It was found in his study, tucked inside a book, La Science du. Good, I assume. I didn't answer. But I didn't need to. Everyone has a copy, Bryce said, almost to himself. It's like a rite of passage. Not very original, though. Neither is murder, I said mildly. But people keep doing it. That got me a longer pause. Then he slid the note back across the table. I'm sorry, Mr. Goodwin, I can't help you. Sure you can, I said. You can tell me why you were pushing Morelli and Rudd to duplicate a product you claimed to respect. He stood. We're done. He didn't slam the door, but he didn't offer to shake hands either, which told me plenty. Back outside, I called Judith Varney. He's cagey, I told her. Polite, polished, and radiating guilt like a bad radiator. Anything else come to mind since our last chat? A pause. Actually, yes, there was a second note. Well, I said, that's a detail worth sharing. I didn't think it was relevant. It was torn. found inside a spice drawer in the kitchen. Just a few words, take it now before... The rest was missing. I thought it was a shopping list. Nothing says grocery panic like implied theft, I said. Do me a favor and don't throw anything else out without asking. Understood. I promised to follow up, then redirected to my next stop. Saul Panzer. He was waiting in a quiet booth at a diner on 10th, sipping black coffee and reading a patent digest. Saul doesn't waste time, especially not mine. Bryce applied for a trademark last month, he said without preamble. Filed under a Shell LLC based in Delaware, but the signature matches his business paperwork. What's the product? A line of heritage preservation brines. 3 flavors. No formulas attached yet, pending submission. But the timing stinks. I nodded. When's the trademark dated? 5 days after Varney's funeral. Well, there it was. Not quite a smoking gun, but a warm one with its hand on the trigger. What about Vermont? Saul flipped a page. Bryce was part of a food science retreat up there 5 years ago. Benton Varney gave a closed-door presentation to a select group. Attendees signed non-disclosure forms. But someone leaked a summary online last year. Mostly guesses, but one blog post mentioned an Eastern European influence, which lines up with the old Polish origin rumor. I sighed. People always talk too much when food is involved. Saul nodded. Also, Bryce has debt. Not huge, but enough. If he needed a win, he might have decided a stolen legacy was better than none at all. Exactly. I left Saul with a tip and a handshake and headed home. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened with his eyes closed and hands on his stomach, his posture for digestion of both facts and food. When I finished, he opened one eye. We are close, he said, but not yet finished. Someone else is involved. Rudd? Possibly, but he lacks the subtlety. Bryce is a forger. Rudd is a thief. One conceives, the other executes. Meaning, Wolfe said. Bryce may not have placed the note, but he provoked someone who did. I frowned. You think the person who left the note wasn't trying to threaten Varney, but warn him? That, Archie, is the question. Wolfe rose slowly and moved to the bookcase. He extracted La Science du Goût, thumbed through it, and shook his head. It is too deliberate, he murmured. Too curated. I watched him, then turned toward the desk. The original note, still folded, was beside the jar. I picked it up. You want to test it for prints? No, it won't matter. The note was handled by someone careful. It is not evidence. It is a signal. Of what? Of fear or conscience. That remains to be seen. He rang for Fritz. Bring Miss Varney tomorrow morning, he said. 9 sharp. And if she asks why? Tell her, Wolfe said, settling back into his chair. We are nearly ready to disturb the peace. I've seen the brownstone weather a lot. Clients in tears, crooks in cuffs, and even the occasional smuggled parrot. But until that morning, I'd never seen Wolfe troubled by absence. And absence, it turns out, can be louder than intrusion. Judith. Varney arrived at 9:02 sharp. Fritz ushered her into the office with a tight expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Wolfe barely acknowledged her beyond a gruff, "Good morning." He was staring at the desk, and not in a contemplative way. "What's missing?" I asked. He answered without looking up. "The note." I blinked. "The original?" "Yes." Now Wolfe is not one for melodrama. He doesn't shout, doesn't pace, and doesn't accuse unless he's sure he can nail someone to the wall. But the tension in the room thickened like cornstarch in broth. "Are you sure you didn't move it?" "Archie." His voice was flat. "You placed it here last evening. I have not touched it since." Fritz appeared in the doorway, tight-lipped. "Nothing. Has been cleaned," he said quickly. "You gave orders." Wolfe nodded. "I know. Judith Varney, to her credit, didn't panic. She stepped forward. "I saw it yesterday," she said. "It was right there." Wolfe turned his head slowly toward her. "Miss Varney, aside from myself, Mr. Goodwin and Fritz, has anyone else entered this office since your first visit?" "No." "Have you told anyone about your second note?" "No, just Archie." "And you retrieved it from where?" "The spice drawer in my kitchen." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Miss Varney, when was the last time you visited your father's house before?" "His death?" She frowned. "A week before the accident. I brought groceries and a copy of a magazine article he asked for. Did you leave anything there? Notes? Messages?" "No." "Why?" He didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he rang the bell. "Fritz," he said, "check the kitchen thoroughly. Look for anything out of place. Drawers, cupboards, spice containers." Fritz vanished with purpose. I watched Wolfe carefully. "You think someone was in the brownstone?" "I think someone has taken something from me without consent," he said. I didn't respond. "There are 2 places on this earth where you do not tamper without consequence: Wolfe's orchid room and his desk." Fritz returned 10 minutes later, holding a small square of folded paper in white gloves. His face was pale. "I found this beneath the turmeric tin," he said. Wolfe took it delicately, opened it, read, handed it to me. This one was in the same block print as the original, but shorter. "Someone else has it." I glanced at Wolfe. "Any idea what the hell it is?" "I suspect we're not talking about pickles." Judith spoke softly. "The formula." Wolfe nodded once. "Or a draft, or a key to it. Something tangible." I considered that. "So someone entered the brownstone, took the original note and left this one in its place. That is the implication. But that's insane. No forced entry, no sign of tampering." "Exactly," Wolfe said, "which means either the intruder was known to us or extraordinarily precise. That narrowed the suspect list to 0 or 5, depending on your level of optimism." Wolfe looked at Judith. "This, Miss Varney, is no longer hypothetical. Someone has risked much to enter my home, silently, invisibly, to tamper with the chain of evidence. That is not the act of a casual observer. It is the act of someone invested." She sat back, stunned. "But how—" "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said, "go, now, find Saul. We require immediate surveillance on Bryce, Rudd, and Morelli." "And Camille?" "No," Wolfe said. "He is too obvious. This is the work of a more patient mind." I grabbed my coat and headed out. Saul and I met in the same booth as before. I handed him the new note. He didn't blink. "I'll start with Bryce," he said. "Then Rudd. If either makes a move, we'll know." Think it was one of them? Or someone working for them? No one else would risk it. You'd be surprised what money and legacy will make people do. He nodded once, stood, and disappeared into the mid-morning crowd. By mid-afternoon we had another visitor. This one invited, Camille Durand, the chef from L'Envie. Wolfe had summoned him not to accuse but to probe. He arrived in a black turtleneck and a frown. "I don't like games," he said as Fritz took his coat. "Then don't play," I said, motioning toward the red chair. Camille sat. Wolfe didn't waste time. "Mr. Durand, when did you last speak to Benton Varney?" Camille blinked. "A week before his death. He brought me a test batch. We drank wine, talked food. He seemed distracted." "Did he say why?" "No, but he mentioned someone had been asking about one of his older notebooks from his Vermont days." Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "Did he name them?" "No, but he said the person wasn't an enemy, just confused." That was interesting. And vague. 2 qualities Wolfe didn't enjoy in tandem. "Did he give you anything? A recipe? A letter?" Camille hesitated. "A jar, unlabeled. He said it was experimental." "Do you still have it?" Camille shook his head. "I tasted it once. It was odd, sweet, unfinished. I threw it away." Wolfe let out a breath that, for him, amounted to a sigh. I regret that, he said. It may have been crucial. Camille stood. If I remember more, I'll call. He left, smelling faintly of time and frustration. That evening I returned to the office to find Wolfe still seated, his eyes closed. The trespass, he said, was not an act of desperation. It was orchestration. You think it was a message? More than that. It was a warning. Someone is trying to control the flow of information, just enough to keep us curious, not enough to reveal truth. Any suspects rising to the top? Bryce and someone unknown, I nodded. So what now? Now, Wolfe said, we wait. Saul will flush movement, and the intruder, if they wish to steer the narrative, will strike again. I raised an eyebrow. You planning to bait them? I already have. He pointed to the desk. A jar sat there, identical to the original. But I knew that jar had been empty yesterday. What's in it? A blend of brine and fiction, a facsimile. I grinned. You left cheese for the mouse. Exactly. Night. Fell. The brownstone was still. But somewhere in that silence, Wolfe knew the real disturbance was yet to come. I've heard Wolfe say more than once that good strategy is like pickling. It's not about the splash, it's about the soak. The right ingredient left long enough in the right brine will reveal what it is and what it wants to be. That Thursday night, with a decoy jar glinting under the desk lamp and an intruder potentially pacing out there in the dark, Wolfe was pickling the hell out of someone. Me? I don't much like waiting. Saul, check in, I asked the next morning as I walked into the office with a fresh suit and stale coffee. Wolfe nodded from his chair. At 6, Bryce left his apartment at dawn, met a man in Washington Square Park. Brief conversation, no exchange. Rudd has made 3 phone calls, 2 of them to legal offices. Morelli has done nothing but place orders for anchovy paste. That doesn't narrow much. No, but consider the pattern. They are reacting. Bryce is jittery, Rudd is shoring up defenses, and someone, Archie, entered this house and removed a note without disturbing a paperweight, meaning they knew the terrain, or were shown it. He gave me a long look. That kind of look from Wolfe means you're about to be assigned something irritating. You think Judith let them in? No, Wolfe said. But someone used her connection, or forged it. Maybe someone. Close to Benton? Possibly, or someone who wants us to believe that. The front bell rang, Fritz answered, and moments later ushered in Martin Lisk, the lawyer. He looked less composed than before. His hands fidgeted with a hat he hadn't removed. This may not be appropriate, he began, standing near the doorway like it might offer an escape. But I've been reviewing some older files related to Mr. Varney's estate. Something odd came up. Wolfe gestured to the red chair. Lisk sat reluctantly. 6 months ago, Benton requested a notarized agreement regarding intellectual property. Transfer. He called it hypothetical but wanted it witnessed. It was never filed with the court, but it exists. What kind of transfer? I asked. To a person named G.T. Hargrove. Wolfe opened his eyes fully. That name has not appeared before. No, Lisk admitted. And I have no idea who it is. I asked Mr. Varney, at the time, if it was a business partner. He simply said, not yet. That was enough to set every instinct I had buzzing. A name with no face, a document with no follow-up, a man who anticipated betrayal and prepared for inheritance. You have a copy? Wolfe asked. Lisk produced it. It was short. A single paragraph of legal transfer language, assigning any unpublished intellectual property related to Benton Varney's fermentation process to G.T. Hargrove, pending signature and date. It had been signed by Varney, but not dated and not delivered. Thank you, Wolfe said in that tone that ends conversations. You've been helpful. Lisk nodded, too relieved to be insulted, and left. I looked at Wolfe. New player, perhaps, Wolfe murmured. Or a mask for an old one. That afternoon Saul called. Bryce met with someone else, he said. Female, mid-30s. Looked familiar. I followed her to an apartment near Union Square, checked the name. Grace Tamsin Hargrove. There it was. She's a food chemist, Saul continued. Used to work with Bryce 5 years ago. Now independent. Started a new LLC 2 months ago. You'll love the name, Brine Works. I repeated that to Wolfe. He gave a long, luxurious sigh. So the recipe was co-developed. Or stolen, I added. Wolfe nodded. Indeed. And she wants her share. I paid Miss Hargrove a visit. She lived in a sleek, industrial-style unit, with copper fixtures and enough dried herbs hanging from the ceiling to season a truckload of chickens. She answered the door in jeans and a lab coat, which either meant she was busy or doing a brand shoot. Yes? She asked. Archie Goodwin. I work with Nero Wolfe. The name still gets reactions. She blinked, then stepped aside. She didn't offer coffee or small talk, just leaned on a work table covered in drying basil. You're here about Benton. I nodded. He stole it, she said. Or he kept it. It started with Bryce. The three of us collaborated. He took our notes, refined them in secret, and launched a private line under his own name, no credit, no royalties. Why wait until now? I didn't. I confronted him a year ago. He told me he'd retire soon, release a memoir, and make things right. And he died before he could do any of that. Do you think Bryce had something to do with it? She smiled bitterly. No, but I think he wanted to get his hands on the formula before I did. He didn't want Benton to fix it. He wanted to own it himself. Why the alias? I asked. The G.T. Hargrove contract? I was scared, she said bluntly. If Benton changed his mind, or if someone wanted to erase me entirely, I wanted some kind of proof that I'd been there all along. That was fair. And sad. Did you come into Wolfe's office? She looked startled. What? Someone took a note. Left another, very quietly, with inside knowledge. I swear I didn't enter your office. I wouldn't risk that. So I believed her, but belief's a loose rope to hang your case on. That evening, Wolfe called a halt to the interviews. All players are now on the board, he said. You sure? Yes, and someone is preparing to tip the board over. How? Because Rudd just called Bryce, Wolfe said, and requested a meeting, private. How do you know? I had Saul install a wire. I grinned. You're enjoying this? I enjoy progress. Now, Archie, call Miss Varney, invite her here tomorrow, and prepare the room. You mean, yes, it's time to bring them all in? The office gathering? Wolfe gave a thin smile. Indeed. The vinegar will clarify. As I stepped out to make calls, I looked back once. Wolfe sat in the middle of the brownstone, like a spider in the web, still, quiet, perfectly still, waiting for the prey to tangle itself in truth. And if someone thought they were pulling strings from the shadows, well, they hadn't seen Wolfe's final move yet. Wolfe's version of confrontation isn't a raised voice or a slammed fist. It's a measured silence, a turned phrase, a gaze that doesn't blink. If you're in the room and he decides to circle, you'll never hear the footsteps, but you'll feel the trap closing syllable by syllable. That Friday morning the trap was being baited with finesse. The invitation calls had gone out the night before, courteous, brief, and deceptively cordial. Each request for a short conversation came with Wolfe's signature undertone. Refuse, and I'll know why. Judith Varney was the first to arrive just after 9. She wore grey slacks and the same jade-coloured blouse she'd worn the day she came in with the pickles. Either she didn't believe in wardrobe rotation, or she liked psychological symmetry. She was calm, but her eyes moved, restless. She didn't like being out of the loop. I assume we're close? She asked. Wolfe didn't look up from his copy of the New York Times book review. Closer, he said, but not quite. That was all she got before the front door rang again. Fritz, running on nerves and civility, admitted Evan Rudd, owner of Root and Vine. He came in looking like he'd just come from a yoga class he didn't enjoy. Sweaty, breathy, twitchy in the shoulders. He gave Wolfe a polite nod, Judith a quick glance, and sat down like the chair might test him. Then came Camille Durand, coat flung over one arm, knife tattoo peeking from under his sleeve like a dare. He smiled broadly at Fritz, then frowned at the seating arrangement. "I thought this was a private matter," he said. "You were misinformed," Wolfe replied, eyes still on the paper. "Privacy is a courtesy, not a guarantee." Leonardo Morelli came in next, briefcase in hand, shoes polished like mirrors, and jaw set like granite. He nodded at no one. And then, finally, Elliot Bryce, in a grey blazer and black shirt, looking exactly like a man who thought he was going to be interviewed. Not interrogated, 5 suspects. 1 client. 2 observers, me and Fritz, standing off to the side like moral referees. Wolfe waited until everyone was seated before folding the paper, setting it aside, and lifting his gaze. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You may be wondering why I've asked you here," he began. No one answered. That was a wise move. Mr. Varney's death was ruled accidental. And yet in the weeks following, several events occurred which suggest a much different narrative. He lifted a finger. 1. A threatening note was found, not in Mr. Varney's home, but in a book. Undated, unattributed, it warned of knowledge. He knew. And that was a mistake. His eyes moved to Bryce, who shifted. 2. A second note, incomplete, hidden in a spice drawer, possibly misplaced, possibly a warning. He turned to Judith. 3. A third note left in this very house. Someone else has it. Not signed, not observed, but unmistakably deliberate. Camille cleared his throat. "What does this have to do with us?" "I was about to arrive at that," Wolfe said coolly. He lifted a small jar from beneath his desk and placed it before him. It was identical to the one Judith had brought, but this one had no label, no name. "This was placed here yesterday. It contains nothing of value, salt water, vinegar, herbs. A forgery. And yet within an hour of its placement, someone returned to this office to examine or retrieve what they believed was real." A pause. Silence thickened. "No one here," Bryce said evenly, "was given access." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Which raises the question, who made the note, who left it? Who risked entry to remove the original and insert another?" Morelli stood. "If you're accusing—" "Sit," Wolfe said. Morelli sat. "I am not accusing, I am revealing." He steepled his fingers. "Let us consider motive. Mr. Bryce, after Mr. Varney's death, you filed a trademark, a preservation product line, suspiciously aligned with Mr. Varney's legacy. You claimed public admiration, but private documents suggest prior collaboration with a woman named Grace Tamsin Hargrove, G.T. Hargrove, the recipient of a draft transfer from Mr. Varney himself." Bryce swallowed. "That was years ago. We co-developed. He promised he would—" Wolfe lifted a finger. "Do not interrupt." He turned to Rudd. "You requested an exclusive distribution deal. When denied, you approached Mr. Bryce for a workaround. Then you contacted legal counsel. Why? Because you were preparing to claim shared ownership of a formula you never saw." Rudd opened his mouth, then closed it. "To be clear," Wolfe said, "this is not criminal. Yet. But it is opportunistic. And it has consequences." Wolfe looked to Morelli. "You, sir, had motive to want the formula suppressed. Exclusive products lose their mystique when duplicated. You funded a small research firm last year. Its only output? A paper on brine stability, co-authored by an unnamed researcher, possibly Ms. Hargrove." Morelli's nostrils flared. Camille leaned forward. "This is all conjecture. Half of us didn't even know Benton kept notes." "Ah," Wolfe said, but someone did. Someone who knew enough to enter the brownstone and remove evidence. That, gentlemen, is not conjecture. That is fact. The room simmered. Wolfe turned to Judith. Miss Varney, do you recall anyone else visiting your father the week of his death? She hesitated. Yes, she said slowly. There was a delivery. Not food. Papers. I didn't think twice. A courier? No, a man, mid-40s, wore glasses. Said he was there to collect review material. My father waved him off. Bryce's hand twitched. Was it him? Wolfe asked. Judith looked at Bryce, then nodded. I didn't know his name at the time, but yes, that's him. Wolfe closed his eyes. The case, he said, is not about murder. It is about theft of authorship, of legacy. Bryce, you feared Benton would reveal your collaboration. You pushed Rudd and Morelli for side deals. You courted Hargrove, then cut her out. Bryce rose. This is absurd. You left the original note, Wolfe continued, then re-entered. This office. You believed the decoy was real. You took it. No proof, Bryce snapped. There will be, Wolfe said softly. Mr. Panzer has a recording of your confession to Rudd last night. You admitted to ghost developing the line. You claimed Varney's formula would be yours, one way or another. The room froze. I'll sue, Bryce said weakly. You won't, Wolfe replied, because the woman you betrayed, Miss Hargrove, will be restoring her name to the formula in a joint release. You'll accept a 10% residual or nothing. Bryce didn't answer. He just sat crushed. When the last guest left, Wolfe rang for beer. He sat in silence for a while, his eyes heavy. Judith stood. I owe you more than I realized. No, Wolfe said. You owe your father honesty, and your legacy some protection. She nodded and left. That evening, over beer and cheese croquettes, I leaned back and looked at him. No violence, no arrests, just exposure. He gave a slow nod. Justice, Mr. Goodwin, he said, is not always retributive. Sometimes it is restorative, and occasionally pickled. I raised a glass to that. By the time the suspects had cleared out, and the echo of their shoes faded from the brownstone's marble foyer, the air in the office felt like the inside of a vacuum jar, compressed, sterile, and waiting for Wolfe to open the lid. He didn't speak. He just sat there with his eyes closed, fingers steepled like he was praying to reason itself. I knew better than to interrupt. Fritz brought in the beer, cold and properly poured. Wolfe took one sip, sighed once, low and internal, and finally opened his eyes. Archie, he said, call Miss Varney, ask her to return this evening alone. She won't be happy with that. She will when I'm done. I made the call. Judith answered on the second ring, and agreed without protest, though her voice carried the wary edge of someone who'd been waiting for the catch in a conversation. She arrived just before 7, no jade blouse this time. She wore black, simple, and sharp, as if the day had shed some of her patience. You found something, she said, before Fritz even closed the door behind her. Wolfe inclined his head. Indeed, please sit. She did. I leaned on the windowsill, pen poised. What I'm about to say, Wolfe began, will not implicate you in any wrongdoing, but it may shift your understanding of recent events. She nodded. Barely. I'm convinced, he continued, that your father's formula was never singular. She frowned. What do you mean? It was collaborative, Wolfe said. Developed during the Vermont Symposium. Your father, Elliot Bryce, and Grace Hargrove contributed to it. Varney perfected it, perhaps even transformed it, but he never claimed full ownership, not privately, but publicly. He kept it quiet to protect it, not from theft, but from dilution. What he did not anticipate, Wolfe said, voice hardening, was betrayal from within. He gestured toward the center of the desk. The note you found, he knew, and that was a mistake, was not a threat against your father. It was a warning to him. A warning from whom? Grace Hargrove, Wolfe said. Judith's mouth fell slightly open. She feared Bryce was planning a takeover. Before Benton could disclose the full truth, Hargrove left the note to alert him. Unfortunately, it came too late, or he misunderstood it, and then he died. That was an accident. Yes, but opportunists don't need to cause accidents, Wolfe said. They only need to be nearby when they occur. Judith sat very still. After the funeral, Bryce made his move. He filed the trademark, approached Morelli and Rudd, pitched a rollout using pieces of the formula, his own reverse-engineered fragments, and what he assumed Varney had taken to the grave. But the real formula still existed, Wolfe said, in your father's study, hidden among drafts. He never disposed of it. Perhaps he intended to give it to you eventually, or to Hargrove. But someone discovered its presence. I stepped forward. Bryce? No, Wolfe said. He never found the formula. He only suspected its existence. Then who? Wolfe turned to Judith. You. Her head snapped up. What? You didn't mean to find it. But you did. When gathering your father's papers, you read enough to recognize it, and you panicked. That's not true, she said, voice flat. You told me yourself, Wolfe said calmly, that you didn't understand the note's significance at first, that you delayed giving it to me. You also said you threw away the unlabeled jar Camille mentioned. But Camille never told you it was unlabeled. I did yesterday. Her face paled, just slightly. You re-entered this office, Miss Varney, not to deceive me, but to remove the original note. Why? Because it named Hargrove or implied her role. You feared it would cloud your father's legacy. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. That wasn't the legacy he wanted. She said softly. He wanted the work to speak for itself. Perhaps, Wolfe said, but he also wanted honesty. That's why he drafted the unsigned transfer to Hargrove, not to give away ownership, to acknowledge contribution, to make peace. She didn't speak. Wolfe leaned back slightly. You have a choice, Miss Varney. You can bury the collaborators and release a posthumous recipe as his sole creation. Or you can do what he intended, credit the minds that shaped it, and preserve the full truth. Judith sat in silence for a long time. I thought I was protecting him, she said at last. I didn't want people saying he stole it, that it wasn't his. It was his, Wolfe said, because he finished it. But what he began was not alone. She nodded slowly, then stood. I'll call Hargrove tomorrow. You should. As she left, she paused at the threshold. Thank you, she said, for protecting more than the formula. Wolfe didn't reply. He didn't need to. Later, I brought in the last of the notes from the file. Copies of Benton's sketches, his, fermentation curves, and a small page of half-formed thoughts written in a rushed scrawl. At the bottom of one was a quote. A man who pickles well preserves more than food. He preserves the patience of time. Wolfe read it, said nothing, and sipped his beer. At 10 that night, I returned to the office to close up. The room was quiet, the scent of herbs and vinegar still faint in the air. Wolfe was still in his chair, reading a volume of Brillat Savarin. I tapped the desk. So, I said, we got no arrest, no chase, no body in the river, but a legacy's been unburied, a thief's been exposed, and the formula lives on. Yes, Wolfe said without looking up. A fine result. I poured myself a splash from the bottle and sat across from him. You know, I said, for all this started with a jar of pickles. We never actually figured out what made them special. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. They were not special because of what was in them, he said. They were special because of who guarded them. That is the flaw in those who seek shortcuts. They chase substance, but forget the soul. He turned a page. Food, like truth, requires fermentation. By Saturday morning, the brownstone had returned to its natural state, quiet, methodical, and mildly irritable. Wolfe was in the plant rooms by 9, misting orchids with the kind of reverence most men reserve for church. Fritz was in the kitchen, reclaiming his spice cabinet like a general retaking a fortified hill. And I was in the front office with a mug of coffee and an inbox full of thank yous and evasions. Judith Varney had kept her word. She'd met with Grace Hargrove that morning. According to Saul, who was discreetly parked across the street at Wolfe's request, the conversation had lasted just under an hour. No raised voices, no legal counsel, just a woman handing over a legacy and another deciding how to share it. They would, Saul said, be co-releasing a tribute recipe in Benton Varney's name, with full attribution to the original team and transparent notes on the final formulation. Wolfe, of course, had no interest in the public rollout, but he seemed satisfied, in that rare invisible way of his. The others, Morelli, Rudd and Bryce, had gone quiet. Bryce, predictably, was already trying to reposition himself as an early collaborator, not a ghost thief. Rudd and Morelli would likely retreat to safer, less spicy ventures for the time being. Camille Durand sent a handwritten thank you and a jar of hand-cured olives, which Wolfe accepted without comment, but with the unmistakable twitch of approval in his brow. There were no police reports, no lawsuits, no splashy headlines, just a few people who'd gone a little too far to protect what didn't belong to them, and one woman who nearly ruined her father's memory to preserve his image. Wolfe believed in preserving things the right way, and he'd done just that. Around noon I brought Wolfe his beer. He was back in his chair gazing at a new addition to the desk, a sealed mason jar with no label. Not one of Judith's, not one of Benton's, Fritz's. I asked him to create something, Wolfe said as I set down the glass, from memory, from method, using only what he believed the recipe required, not what it claimed. And? Wolfe unscrewed the lid and took a long, deliberate sniff. Adequate, he murmured. For Fritz, that was a commendation worthy of national recognition. I sat opposite him, flipping through my notes. It's rare, I said, that a case comes and goes without a crime scene, without handcuffs. Wolfe didn't look up. It is rarer, he said, for those involved to recognize the shape of their wrongdoing without the sting of consequence. Miss Varney, Miss Hargrove, even Bryce in his cowardice understands what he almost became. And what was that? Unoriginal. I raised an eyebrow. You think originality is the real sin? No, Wolfe said. But pretending to be original when you are merely opportunistic? That is theft of the worst kind, of credit, of memory, of invention. Sounds like a food critic I knew in Queens. He gave me a look. I let it pass. Later that day, as the clouds gathered for one of those moody New York spring rains, Fritz served a late lunch, duck confit with garlic potatoes and a small side of thinly sliced sweet pickled carrots. The carrots, Wolfe declared, were curious, which I suspected meant he liked them but didn't want to be quoted. After lunch, I caught Wolfe staring at the orchids longer than usual. I waited until he returned to the office before asking, "You thinking about Benton Varney?" "No." Pause. "About what he left behind?" Wolfe nodded once. "About what he left unfinished?" I watched him. "You think he wanted this outcome?" "I think," Wolfe said. "He hoped it would never be necessary, but he prepared for it. That is the difference between a craftsman and an artist. The craftsman records, the artist conceals. Varney, to his credit, was both." "Then you're satisfied?" "I am content." Coming from Wolfe, that was practically elation. Just before 5, Saul dropped off the last of the surveillance logs. Nothing new, no late-night phone calls, no disposal runs, no mysterious fourth party waiting in the wings. The web, it seemed, had been fully traced. Wolfe barely glanced at the pages before sliding them into the file folder marked Varney. He closed it, sealed it. Done. At 6, I was ready to call it. The sky was darkening. The wind was turning cool, and the office smelled faintly of lemon oil and cooked duck. "You know," I said, "it's been a while since we had a case that ended this cleanly." "Phooey," Wolfe said. "There is nothing. A clean-about compromise? You mean the joint recipe?" "I mean the cost of what wasn't said." I leaned back in my chair. "You think she'll regret it?" "No," Wolfe said, "but others will. Particularly those who assumed silence would shelter them. Truth, Mr. Goodwin, is like vinegar. It preserves, but it also burns. Especially when rubbed in the wrong place. That is your phrasing." He reached for his beer. I stood, stretched, and headed for the kitchen, already thinking about what I'd order in later. Fritz had declared the evening meal was to be simple, which usually meant it would take 2 hours and 3 languages to describe. Wolfe called after me. "Archie." I paused. "Yes?" He didn't look up. "Remind me, do we still have that last jar from Miss Varney?" "In the fridge, back row." "Why?" He waved a hand. "Nothing. I may ask Fritz to dissect it next week." Scientific curiosity. Wolfe glanced at the window where raindrops had just begun to tap against the glass. "No, sentimentality." Now that made me pause. I gave him a long look. Then I said, "Well, if you ever decide to pickle a case file, let me know." "I'll bring the vinegar," Wolfe groaned. I went to the kitchen, grinning. The week after the office gathering passed in quiet ripples. Wolfe, as was his custom, resumed his sacred routines like nothing had happened. Orchids at 9 and 4. Beer at 6. Meals with Fritz precisely timed and portioned. Me, I answered a few polite follow-ups from Judith Varney and fielded one disgruntled call from Bryce, who still believed Wolfe had manipulated him into confession without ever laying a finger or raising a voice, which, to be fair, was accurate. In the rear cabinet, the Varney file now lived between a counterfeit airship dispute and a case involving missing truffles from a Belgian import line. No arrests, no headlines, no bodies. Just a secret shared, exposed, and handed back with dignity intact. But dignity, like brine, has a way of seeping deeper over time. That Friday morning, Judith came by one last time. She brought nothing but a slim envelope and an expression that made her look 10 years older and 10 pounds lighter. She'd made peace, she said. The co-authored recipe was being finalized for publication in the Culinary Archivist, and Grace Hargrove had been offered a full credit line and a 20% share in any future commercial licensing. She didn't ask for it, Judith told Wolfe, but she accepted. "We're figuring out how to be honest." Wolfe nodded once. "No." Phrase no sentiment, just a look that for him passed as solemn approval. "And the jar?" she asked. Wolfe pointed to a side table, where the last of Benton Varney's pickles sat under careful refrigeration. Judith walked over, picked it up, and cradled it like it was something alive. "I'll take this, if you don't mind," she said softly. "It's yours," Wolfe said, as it always was. After she left, I found Wolfe back in the kitchen, nose hovering over a bowl of something dark, sticky, and mildly alarming. "Experiment?" I asked. "Red onion and clove pickle, Fritz's invention. Safe to eat?" "I'll let you test." "That?" I declined. We returned to the office. The late afternoon sun made the stained glass panel above the bookshelf glow like fire caught in amber. I was thinking about taking the evening off when Wolfe spoke again. "Do you know why I took the case, Archie?" "You had an itch for vinegar." His eyes closed. I waited. He opened them again slowly because Miss Varney made a mistake. That much was obvious. "No," Wolfe said, "not the kind most make. She didn't come to me with a grievance or an accusation. She came with doubt, a suspicion she didn't want to prove. That is rare. People seek confirmation, not clarity. She, against her instinct, sought truth. She also entered your office without permission and stole a note. Yes. And then returned it with a confession. She was lucky you're not a vindictive man. I am, Wolfe said, when the intent is malicious. Hers was not. I leaned back, watching him. You think people like her will keep the formula safe? No, he said. I think they will complicate it, but they will also preserve its value. And that is the best one can hope for with anything worth saving. I nodded slowly. You ever think about what people will do with your legacy? Constantly, he said. That's why I'm careful who I let near my recipes. You mean your methods? No, Wolfe said. My menus. He let that hang in the air, like a cigar puff that didn't need to be inhaled. The rain returned that evening, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the office windows. It didn't bother Wolfe. He liked storms in theory, their predictability, their inevitable dissipation. I poured us both a finger of brandy and sat in my usual spot. You know, I said, we never did find out how Benton made that brine. So special. Fritz's version was close, but not quite. No, Wolfe agreed. It lacked the patience. I smirked. Not enough garlic? Wolfe shook his head. Not enough intention. A recipe, Archie, is not merely a list of steps. It is a record of choices, the ones made and the ones refused. He raised his glass. To choice, he said. I clinked mine against his. To appetite, I replied. He gave me one of those long looks that meant both agreement and disdain, and then he smiled. Just barely. At dinner, Fritz served an herb roasted, squab with a delicate beet glaze. For the side, a small dish of house-pickled vegetables, onions, carrots, cucumbers, and something unidentifiable but delicious. Wolfe praised it without superlative, which was about as close to ecstasy as he got afterward. As he retired to his room with a volume of Montaigne and the remains of his beer, I sat in the office alone, watching the city lights flicker across the window pane like fireflies with a union. The case had begun with something simple, pickles in a jar, and ended with something harder. A daughter confronting her father's imperfections, a scientist facing down her obscurity, and a thief being left with the bitter taste of almost. No crime had been committed, but a wrong had still been righted. Sometimes, Wolfe says, justice is intellectual, not because it's abstract, but because it knows where to land its weight. The phone rang at 10:03. I answered. It was Saul. Just wanted you to know, he said. Bryce has quietly dropped his trademark application, and Hargrove has registered. The formula under Varney Hargrove method, variant B. Thought you'd want to tell the big man. I did. Wolfe nodded from his doorway. Good, he said. Justice by footnote. At 11 I turned off the lights, locked the office door and headed for bed. The brownstone was quiet, still, settled, as it should be. There are endings that feel like slamming a door and others that feel like turning a key in a lock. This one was neither. It was more like sealing a jar, airtight, deliberate, final. Wolfe didn't slam, didn't lock, and certainly didn't rush. He just made sure everything was preserved, facts, motives, reputations, in their proper layers. The last piece came the following Monday, wrapped in legal language and couriered by a clerk who looked like he'd gotten lost somewhere between Yale and Dread. Wolfe barely acknowledged him. He took the envelope, slit it open with the edge of a butter knife, and unfolded the paper with the same gravity most men reserve for birth certificates or land deeds. It was from Judith Varney. Not a thank you, not a confession, a document, a notarized co-authorship contract listing the Varney Hargrove method, brine series A and B, with distribution rights reserved, credit lines declared, and a dedication to Benton Varney for the integrity of craft, above all else. Wolfe read it once, twice, then folded it and placed it atop the closed Varney file. That, he said, is sufficient. I raised my eyebrows. That's it? Yes? No scolding? No epigrams? I am not a fortune cookie, Mr. Goodwin, I grinned. Tell that to the 3 people you verbally pickled last week. He didn't rise to it. He just reached for the bell cord and rang for beer. We dined in near silence that evening, save for the clink of silverware and the occasional appreciative grunt from Wolfe. Fritz had outdone himself, braised duck with rosemary, creamed celeriac, and a modest dessert of poached pear in brandied syrup. There was a garnish of pickled kumquat on the side. Wolfe did not comment, which meant he approved. After dinner, Wolfe returned to the office while I cleaned up a few loose ends. One final report from Saul, confirming that Bryce had stepped away from all public claims to the recipe and that Morelli and Rudd had returned to their lanes, more cautious now, less ambitious. I stepped into the office, closed the door behind me, and leaned on the back of the red chair across from Wolfe. You know, I said, if you ever want to go into the gourmet food racket, you'd make a killing with that kind of control. I abhor commerce, he muttered. Its demands are vulgar. You like the results, though. Results, yes. Market pretense, no. He reached over, lifted the decoy jar from his desk, the one we'd baited the intruder with, and turned. It once in his hands, it was never about the pickles, he said. No, I agreed. It was about control, about who got to write the label. Wolfe nodded, then set the jar down with finality. Miss Varney feared her father would be forgotten. Mr. Bryce feared being left out. Miss Hargrove feared being erased. None of them wanted the truth. They wanted a version of it that served their ambition or guilt. And you? I wanted stillness, peace, sanctity, he corrected. My orchids do not scheme. My kitchen does not lie. But men ferment more than vegetables. They ferment history. Sounds like something you'd etch on your tombstone. He shot me a look. Don't be morbid. I shrugged. You're the one who talks about death in terms of flavor profiles. He didn't dignify that with a response. As the clock inched past 11, the city dimmed outside. The windows. The brownstone held its breath again, the kind of quiet that only comes after a case has been laid flat, folded up and stored where it can't do harm. Wolfe tapped the folder on his desk. This will remain sealed, he said. No memoirs. No excerpts. The truth is not for consumption. You sure? I'm certain. He reached for his beer, sipped, and then, unexpectedly, spoke again. There is a difference, Archie, between preserving and hoarding. Benton Varney understood that in the end. He left behind a method, yes, but more importantly, he left the choice of how to use it. I nodded, and Judith made the right one. No, Wolfe said. She made a right one. There are always others. He leaned back, let out a slow breath, and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Preserve what matters, he said finally. Discard what does not. Then, with a grunt, he stood. I'm going to bed. Want me to lock the file? No, Wolfe said. Let it cool. He left, and I stood there alone in the office, listening to the sound of his heavy footsteps, fading up the stairs. I gave the Varney file one last look. No gun, no blood. Just notes, envy, pride, and a damn good brine. I slid it into the drawer, turned the key, and shut off the light. Another case sealed, preserved in truth. And maybe, just maybe, a little garlic.